I enjoyed the discussion, but the title of this message is The Cost of Being a Disciple. So I guess let's continue. Before we start, I just want to warn you that there's two versions of the Bible that I really like, King James Version and New Living Translation. So the reason for that is if I want to read the story, I like the New Living Translation because they speak in my English. And then if I really want to study verses, meanings of words and things, I like the King James Version because it feels very word by word and detailed. So I used to just preach out of this Bible, but then I would be reading a passage and switch horses in midstream, so to speak, confuse everybody, mostly me. So the reason I say all that is I've got the verses on my notes instead of in here, but I want to read out of Luke 14 and Matthew 5, both. Luke 14 I'm going to be reading from NLT. Matthew 5 I'll be reading from King James Version. Okay, we'll just go to Luke 14, verse 25. A large crowd was following Jesus. He turned around and said to them, "If you want to be my disciple, you must, by comparison, hate everyone else, your father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even your own life. Otherwise, you cannot be my disciple. And if you do not carry your own cross and follow me, you cannot be my disciple. But don't begin until you count the cost. For who would begin the construction of a building without first calculating the cost to see if there is enough money to finish it? Otherwise, you might complete only the foundation before running out of money, and then everyone would laugh at you. They would say, 'There's the person who started that building and couldn't afford to finish it.' Or what king would go to war against another king without first sitting down with his counselors to discuss whether his army of 10,000 could defeat the 20,000 soldiers marching against him? And if he can't, he will send a delegation to discuss terms of peace while the enemy is still far away. So you cannot become my disciple without giving up everything you own." So this message is for me today. This is a journey I've been on. And all I'm doing is just sharing with y'all where I'm at. You don't have to agree with me. And I don't have it all figured out. But I'm going to switch over to Matthew 5 and just go through the Beatitudes for the rest of this message, because I think if we want to look at the cost, there's a lot of stuff in the Beatitudes, and we can unpack a lot of it in a fairly short period of time. Like, we should be able to be done by 5. But if we really were going to do the Beatitudes justice, we would probably need one hour message per Beatitude. Matthew 5, verse 3. "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." So I looked up the word poor and the word spirit in the Greek, and the way that it looks to me is those who are destitute in identity are blessed, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven, because they receive citizenship in the kingdom. Okay. The reason I say identity is because spirit in there, it can mean a couple things, but it looks to me like it means something along the lines of who you are, deep inside you, like even inside your soul. And poor means lacking. So I would say lacking identity. So I like to pick on people to make points. Let me see. Joni. Yes, Joni. Monroe. You're another one. One more. Leo. You three want to come up here? You can just stand over on this side. Well, not all that way over there, but that's maybe here, right there. Don't move. I need tape for him. Monroe can stand right in front of here, and Leo can stand on the other side. So let's say all three of these men, they're visual aids, by the way. This is not about, when I talk about them, I'm not talking about them. Does that make sense? So, all three of these men love Jesus, right? And they have been born again. They've received Christ into their lives. This guy is still a man of the world. He loves Jesus very, very much. He loves to talk about God's grace and his love. And he is really happy that his eternity is sorted out so that he can focus on his life. And that could look like a couple things. It could look like being a really good businessman, or it could look like being a drunk. But whatever he likes to do in this world. But at least he loves Jesus. All the way over here, this guy, he has really studied the Word and figured it all out. He really knows all of it. So he starts a new denomination, a new church. And he has certain spiritual gifts that really, really, really matter. And you're either in or out with him. If you don't see it the way he sees it, it's over for you. You're burnt toast, basically. So, I'm not talking about Joni or Leo. Okay. Now here's the guy in the middle. And again, I'm not talking about Monroe. But he's got nothing. There's absolutely nothing about him, any gifts that he's shoving forward, any type of person that he is carving out himself as, that would impress you or draw any attention to himself. Like, there's literally nothing there. Not talking about Monroe. But that is being poor in spirit. Now, which of these three is qualified for discipleship? To be a disciple, you need to be part of God's kingdom. You're interested in advancing God's kingdom. To me, it looks like this guy has his own new religious kingdom. This guy has his own new worldly kingdom. It's great that they both love Jesus, but to my way of thinking, they've disqualified themselves for discipleship. This guy has no kingdom. So, he's a disciple. It might look like he owns stuff, but to his way of thinking, God owns it, and he's just stewarding it. Is that making sense, or do I pick on them some more? I know it makes sense to them because they want to go away. All right. Well, thank you. Y'all are dismissed. To me, that's what it looks like to be a disciple, to be poor in spirit. If you look at the prodigal son story, I would say the older brother was a little like the guy over here. I would say the younger brother, when he left, was a little bit more like the guy over here. When he came back, he was a little bit more like the guy in the middle. I am not trying to make any judgments about salvation. It's not my job. It's not a job I want. It's not a job I'm allowed to do. I'm just saying that in the world we live in today, with the amount of religious freedom we have, I think we have these three different Christian groups, in a sense, very generally. So I have it. A disciple cares the most about God and his kingdom. He cares more about that than anything else. A Christian cares most about Jesus and his ability to save people. And we've talked about that. That's what I would see as the difference. Matthew 5, verse 4. Blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted. Unfortunately, we all know, or I shouldn't say all, there's probably some of you in here that never struggled with this like I have, becoming bitter. I'm so glad that y'all never struggle with bitterness. It's wonderful. But we know I know what it's like to hold a grudge and become bitter if someone hurts me. And to me, that's an example of not mourning. I would call it, but there's another kind of refusing to mourn, and I call it bottling it. And I'm not sure quite what else to call it, but at least it gives me another excuse to share a history lesson. So I'm going with that. There was a man who was known as Quiet Cow because he almost never spoke. His dad was the same way. They said his dad treated words like a box of fine chocolates. I could use some of that wisdom. And Cal noticed how his dad's quiet manner was a strength in town meetings because he almost never spoke. And when he did, everybody wanted to hear what he had to say when he did speak. But Cal got even quieter than his dad. At age 12, there was a tragedy. His mom died of tuberculosis. There was a lot of sadness in the family. And the time came for Cal and his dad to see his mom one last time. In that sad moment, his dad said to Cal, "Don't cry." So Cal did not cry. His sister died, and again, there was no crying. He grew into a man who was irritable and melancholy, very difficult to be around. He graduated college and he entered politics. He got married and had 2 sons. He rose in power and became the 30th president of the United States, Calvin Coolidge. Now I don't want to get political, but he was a fiscal conservative. He had a very novel concept and introduced an actual balanced budget to the United States government. And the country went into some prosperity. He wasn't perfect. There was mistakes like any other leader. But disaster struck the Coolidge family. One of his sons got blood poisoning and died. On the deathbed, Cal sat by his son, and his son was holding this little locket in his hand. And in that locket was a picture of his mom, and actually a little bit of her hair, like a lock of her hair. And when the boy was dying, the locket fell out of his hand and onto the floor. And the president and first lady were plunged into very deep depression. And he became known for taking really long naps, at times only working 4 hours a day. He was not able to find joy in anything. He blamed himself for every little thing. There was no spark. His wife struggled with all this and had an affair. And yet in all that, he was a successful, as in popular president, and everybody wanted him to run again. But then he shocked everybody by announcing that he didn't want to be president anymore and was not going to run again. And he slipped into private life and just disappeared. So the point of all that is, in sorrow, there is a Gethsemane, so to speak, a place you have to actually give the sorrow to God. You have to let it out. And that's what I would get out of "Blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted." In my view, Cal didn't actually mourn. Verse 5 is, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." Now, there was a whole sermon called "Blessed are the Praus" on YouTube. I had it on meekness. It has to do with margins. When I had Caleb up here with the axe, and he was capable of doing a lot of damage to the building, but he decided not to, that was meekness. It's not the same as weakness. Okay, verse 6, "Blessed are they which do hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be filled." Are we willing to walk around starving and parched? so empty of our own ideas on what's right and wrong and desperate for God's righteousness? Or do we need to figure it all out and be right? I tend to think rightness is worldly righteousness, the just and fair thing based on available human evidence and reasoning. It comes from God to a degree because He created the world and established moral laws that work for the most part. God's laws work, but the way we live them doesn't always work. Righteousness is God's way of seeing things and His truth. It includes some rightness, but it transcends it completely because it's from the nature of God. So the man up here who had nothing of his own, he's just going to be filled with God's righteousness. For me, the hardest thing about God's righteousness is if I know I'm facing something in a few days, I want to figure it out before I get there. I think God wants to tell me once I'm there what to do. I want to know now. So I'll be apt to study it out and figure it out. So we have to decide if we want to be right or if we want God's righteousness. Verse 7, blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. What is mercy? Mercy is that desire to see the good for other people no matter what they have done or no matter who they are. In effect, mercy is the opposite of persecution, which we'll get to later. It means that you are willing to do what's best for them, even if they don't like it, even if you don't like it, whatever the case may be. And I feel like the merciful obtain mercy from God because the only people who are truly and reliably merciful as a way of life are God's people. Other people can do merciful acts from time to time when it suits them, but God's people can actually access a nature from God that makes mercy a way of life, whereas the world's way is more a way of persecution. Verse 8, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Pure can also mean empty. Pure water is empty of anything that isn't water. I checked the Greek word for heart. I think in this context it means soul. Your mind, your will, and your emotions. All three of them are sitting in the middle and informing what you do, like your operating system. And if your heart is not pure, there are other things in there that are informing your life. Are you willing to ask God to make your heart pure, to take out all the things that are not there? That is part of the cost. Verse 9. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. This is another deep statement. These Beatitudes aren't just nice-sounding phrases when you really dig into them. They're pretty serious. They're thought-provoking and life-changing if you absorb them. Peace is something that is marvelous for what it doesn't have. How many of you come up on this lake and it's so smooth on top and the water is so clean that you can use it like this mirror? And you just want to take a picture of it, and you find pictures like it on the internet and make that your wallpaper on your computer or something. You know what I'm talking about? That is a physical picture of peace. And that lake has a smooth surface, and it's smooth underneath, peaceful underneath, because the water is not dirty, it's not being stirred up. So there are ways you can attempt to be a peacemaker. You can, if you're the government, you can have enough nukes so that people are afraid to attack you. That can be looked at as peace. But underneath that surface, there is a turmoil. You know, if something happens to your nukes, World War III, here we come. Something like that. Like during parts of the Cold War, people might have said, finally, peace, when things were kind of dead. But then it wasn't real, because every time somebody got too close to the nuke buttons, everybody freaked out again. I feel like God's people are the only ones that have real peace from the inside out. And that's the thing of manifesting it. God creates the peace within you. All right, so for now I want to, before we take the last Beatitudes, I want to share something with you, where I'm at. What I'm going to share is how I think we got here, essentially. To me, this is the history of Christianity, how we got here, where we have, in the Bible, I don't really think we saw many of those kinds of Christians. And then I personally am struggling with, why do I end up over there and over here all the time? Because this is for me. I want to be in the middle. I don't want to have anything of my own. I only want God. So I think if we trace the history all the way back to Genesis, we see God wanting a relationship with all of us. We see his power, the way he created the world through spoken words. He made man and woman in his image, and he formed them by hand from the earth, which he had created by his spoken word. And he placed them in this perfect world and provided them with freedom of choice. Tree of knowledge of good and evil was there, and the tree of life was there. They were told to not eat from knowledge. It would bring death on the day they ate, and it did. Because when they ate, they were separated from God, and that's a worse death than being separated from their physical bodies in the way we think of death. With the passage of time, the world got worse and worse and worse. And that's where we see the flood. It looked to me like God wanted to wash the world. But all who were really still hungry after God were invited to rise above it in an ark. Unfortunately, there were only 8 that wanted it. They survive and repopulate the world again. Now, people attempt one world government with the Tower of Babel. They try to reach God in heaven by their own strength with a tower, kind of like the person over here. God does not appreciate this very much. But rather than destroying them, he gives them many languages that then helps them scatter. Finally, God is ready to have a people again. It starts with a promise to a man named Abram, later Abraham. This promise is transferred generationally. During Abraham's physical time on earth, he did not see the promise fulfilled. It goes to Isaac. It goes to Jacob. And then finally, in a time of intense slavery and suffering in Egypt, God pulls his people out and takes them back to the land he promised them. But this physical nation had many flaws with their sins and such. The power of God left and they got overrun because they didn't repent. They went here and here. Eventually, they were relegated to just being a province in the Roman Empire. But along the way there, many different prophets that spoke of a coming Messiah who was going to fix everything. Jesus Christ, born in a manger, grew up to be a carpenter. And at age 30, he taught things that were hard to hear. He claimed to be the Messiah. He said he would die for us, and then he did. It was brutal, and it was R-rated. But he got up and walked out of the grave again. And to me, that proves he's the Messiah and that he had the power. It proved once and for all, if this man can undead himself, what could he do to the Roman Empire if he wanted to? It's a fair question, not? If Christ was able to stop being dead, the way we think of it, what could Christ do to the Roman Empire? The Roman Empire was very evil, the way they treated the Jews. Anyone have any thoughts on that? Is there anyone think that Christ could have just completely flattened the Roman Empire and just made it go away if that would have been his mission? Am I the only one that thinks that? Yes. I see several people agreeing with that. But he never did. That's just it. He had, 33 years to do it, and he never did it. He said, just give to Caesar that which is Caesar's, and to God that which is God's. Well, anyway, getting off topic a little bit. Christ was up again. He didn't always bother with doors. Now he just starts appearing and disappearing and reappearing kind of how he wanted to. I kind of wish I could do that sometimes. He told his closest followers to wait at a place for his return in the form of a comforter, and his disciples did that. And one day something came over them. They received clarity on things that Jesus taught them. They were able to speak in languages that they themselves did not understand. They received a supernatural boldness and began to meet to worship the Lord together. They established these meetings in other areas by getting people to transfer their allegiance from their world kingdom to God's kingdom. This spread and spread and spread. And remember, Christ never did anything to the Roman Empire. In fact, the Roman Empire, I would argue, got worse. For hundreds of years, this was faithfully followed. People would switch allegiance to God's kingdom. They would get killed off by the world kingdoms and the Jews for doing it, but they kept right on. They were disciples. God's kingdom was their first loyalty. They would only obey the world kingdom when it did not conflict with God's kingdom, because that was also one of God's kingdom ways. It happened, the world's first famous Christian was born, and he basically was the emperor of Rome, Constantine, and he came to a place in his life, I don't know, like that's not my place to judge, but he came to a place in life where he loved Jesus. And then many, many other disciples or people. Now it became popular. The persecution stopped. And Christians were in the government. And they started dealing with tough questions. Like, what wars are right or not? The Crusades were okay. They were going to take the Holy Lands back for God. That's how they saw it. But disciples, before then, didn't really know that just war was a thing. They thought when Jesus said to love your enemies and turn the other cheek, that's literally what he meant. They didn't know they were supposed to do anything with the world government. And with the way it was structured, they didn't know they were supposed to hold office in it. They thought all allegiance to God's kingdom, they were willing to lose their heads for Christ, literally. So that persecution made them tend to go all in or not at all. Well, when the persecution stopped, that's the compromise, and the church started, in my opinion, or at least on a bigger scale. The world was plunged into the dark ages, and the disciples, the early church-style disciples, disappeared off the pages of history. I think by the only time you really see it is like if people privately go out into the wilderness to just seek God. Many, many, many years later, 3 men left the church, along with several others, And they started to try to take the teachings of Jesus literally, the way the early church had done. They desired that whole thing again. A movement started, and then persecution started. Now, instead of the Jews in the world kingdom, it was Christians in the world kingdom who were persecuting. And people who left got pretty testy about it and started persecuting back. There was a bloody mess, literally. Even people who went with the three men did some persecution. No denomination had a clean record here. I'm not naming people because I don't want to put anyone on a pedestal. It's not about denominations. No denomination had a clean record here. But discipleship showed back up in history again. And then there came the concept of freedom in the West. Now, as far as world kingdoms go, I am a huge fan of the West, especially the United States. Would y'all agree? The idea that you have rights and that government's supposed to protect those rights and not try to step all over you. So what that does then is it brings us to a crossroads. With the three men standing up here, no matter what you choose, this guy, or this guy, your persecution is going to be pretty light, mostly verbal probably. So you have a choice. But I think the cost is a lot higher to choose discipleship. I think it is. Because you don't get to own anything anymore. You don't get to have your own kingdom anymore. The things that you technically purchased are things you're stewarding. If God says give it to somebody, you give it. No questions asked. God says do, you jump. On the way up, you ask how high. That's what discipleship should be all about. I'm not sure how to explain it's worth it. There's something that happens on the inside that makes it worth it, and I don't know how to explain that. Matthew thought so. He disappeared off the pages of Scripture. And I researched to see where he went. Do y'all know where Matthew went? He went south, way south. I look it up on a map. He went to Ethiopia, well over 1,000 miles away. And he didn't have a very good car to get there. I don't know what he drove. Probably a donkey. But he went all the way down there, was spreading the gospel. And he wasn't back in the Roman Empire anymore. But while he was down there, great danger. The day came when somebody threw a spear and got him in the back, and that was when he went to meet Jesus again. And people don't know who threw the spear. Was it a native tribesman, or was it somebody who was still mad at him from the Roman Empire that came down to get him? But I want to decide today to be the man in the middle. No matter what comes, God's kingdom is the only thing worth it for me. That's where I stand. I can't do any more. I guess we need to finish up the Beatitudes. Matthew 5, verse 10. Blessed are they which are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are ye when men shall revile you and persecute you, and shall say all manner of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven, for so persecuted they the prophets which were before you. So to me, persecution is when someone is being hurt physically, emotionally, or in any way mistreated just for who they are or what they did. And in life, on this fallen earth, you will run a risk of being persecuted no matter what you choose. If you think about it, There's a story out there that I'm not going to share here. It's called the Bataan Death March. Japanese captured a whole bunch of American soldiers in the whole Pacific theater, World War II. The things they did to them were terrible. Persecution levels that were similar to what you might read about Martyr's Mirror. And I would say those soldiers were persecuted for being American soldiers who fought back. If you read about Nazi Germany during and before World War II, you'll see where Jews were being persecuted just for who they are. That was terribly wrong. There's a book, very, very interesting book out there called Killing the SS. I recommend, but only for adults. It's pretty graphic, and you have to like history too. There's a lot of stories of Jewish authorities persecuting the Nazis after the war, finding them, rounding them up, bringing them back, and bringing them to justice. And in that case, the Nazis, a lighter form of what they had dished out, persecution. And I'm not saying that world kingdoms should stop justice. I mean, to me, world governments are basically a way God works through to control people who aren't fully discipled with Christ. I don't believe that real disciples of Christ actually need a world government. So I would propose that while we have the opportunity in a relatively free country to decide who we are going to be persecuted for, where I am going is I only want to ever be persecuted for God and His kingdom. I don't want to necessarily be persecuted for America. I don't want to be persecuted for the Western society. I don't want to be persecuted for defending my property. As far as I'm concerned, I want to learn what it means to not have any property. The only cause that's worth anything, to my way of thinking, is Christ and His kingdom. So that's where I stand, and I can't do any more than that. Thank you all for listening. I hope that wasn't too heavy now. Blessings to you.